playing football can be tough for various reasons, both good and bad. In the past, the game was even harder on players. In the NFL, players' careers were not as secure, and many got hurt badly. Sadly, some really talented players had to stop playing because of terrible injuries. In this video, I picked 3 players from different times in NFL history who sadly meet these criteria. To make it more interesting, we'll begin by talking about the least known guy on the list, Greg Cook. In the year 1969, when dinosaurs were walking around, just kidding, the Cincinnati Bengals faced a pivotal moment during the draft. They had the 5th overall pick and narrowly missed out on selecting Joe Green. Instead, they opted for the next best option, Greg Cook, who had showcased his skills during his entire college career at Cincinnati. Now, Greg Cook was ready to bring his A-game to the Bengals. In those days, it was uncommon for rookies to immediately take on starting roles because they were often seen as inexperienced. However, Greg Cook defied the norm. He outshone Sam Wyke in the training camp, earning himself the starting spot in Week 1 of the season. There was a catch, though. The Bengals were only in their 2nd year in the league, and their team comprised not only football players but also your local electrician, and a few players picked up from other teams. Even though it's absolutely true, the Bengals, who were still pretty new in the football world, had some of the best coaches ever, especially head coach Paul Brown and wide receivers coach Bill Walsh. We'll talk more about them in a bit. Right now, let's go back to the first week of the 1969 NFL season when the top quarterback in the draft, Greg Cook, started playing. In his very first game, Greg did really well, completing 11 out of 21 passes for 155 yards with 2 touchdowns and 2 interceptions. You might not think that's super impressive, but remember, things were different back then. Just to give you an idea, Hall of Famer Terry Bradshaw, who was the #1 pick in the next draft, had a debut that was, well, a bit different from Greg's. It could always be worse, but Greg Cook wasn't finished showing what he could do. In Week 2 against the Chargers, he had his best game yet, completing 14 out of 22 passes for an amazing 327 yards, 3 touchdowns, and 1 interception. The Bengals won that game 34-20. It was this game and what was happening behind the scenes that made the legendary figures I mentioned earlier say things like, and I promise I'm not making this up, Bill Walsh once said, Greg Cook was, I believe, the greatest talent to ever play the position. He could play today or any time in the history of the NFL. While he played, he was the best there was. It might seem a bit strange because the person talking was pretty close to this guy, but what Bill said actually had some truth to it. Greg Cook was a lot like Tom Brady in terms of height and weight, both being 6'4" and around 220 pounds, but he was even more athletic. He threw the ball like Justin Herbert and had a special ability to understand defensive strategies before the game even started. Surprisingly, he had all these skills within just 2 games of his career. So, when Bill Walsh said Greg Cook was the best he'd ever seen after only 1 year with him, it might not be as crazy as it sounds. Unfortunately for Greg Cook, his career took a really bad turn. In a Week 3 game against the Chiefs, he got sacked, and what seemed like a normal hit for a quarterback resulted in a torn rotator cuff in his throwing shoulder. Nowadays, players like Alshon Jeffrey and Drew Brees have played through similar injuries, and even Ben Roethlisberger recovered fully from a torn rotator cuff in his throwing shoulder. But in the 1960s, especially for football players, medical technology wasn't advanced enough. Instead of just taking time to help Cook's injury get better, the doctors talked to Greg and said, "We can fix your shoulder, or we can give you a bunch of drugs to ease the pain so you can play on Sundays." Hopefully. So, for the rest of his first season, Greg Cook played with a torn shoulder. By the end, the injury ended his career. Cook played 1 more game for the Bengals in the 1973 season, 4 years after the injury, and he completed only 1 pass. And that was the end for Greg Cook. I won't go into what happened after his playing days because honestly, it's really sad. But Greg Cook had a 2-game stretch that amazed even the smartest football people. On the other hand, some players who had short bursts of brilliance lasted a bit longer. When you hear the name Shannon Sharpe, you probably think of the Hall of Fame tight end, the loud guy who talks about Michael Jordan, or the well-dressed man from TikTok. Shannon Sharpe has been good at whatever he does for a long time. However, what's interesting is that, even though he was great throughout his entire NFL career, his brother was even better for a short time. Sterling Sharpe was a talented college football player at the University of South Carolina. He joined the professional league in 1988 after being selected 7th overall in the draft, right between two legendary receivers, Tim Brown and Michael Irvin. This meant that people always compared Sterling to these great players throughout his career, whether he liked it or not. In the beginning, Sterling stood out and seemed to be the best among them. During his first 3 seasons in the league, he caught 212 passes, gained 3,119 yards, and scored 19 touchdowns. It's worth mentioning that he achieved all this while dealing with the challenges of having an inconsistent quarterback, Don Majkowski. Interestingly, he was also known by the nickname the Magic Man. However, as his quarterback's performance declined and another journeyman quarterback shared playing time, Sterling's stats took a hit, and he experienced his first season with less than 1,000 receiving yards since his rookie year. Then, in 1992, the Green Bay Packers acquired a new quarterback, Brett Favre, who had a penchant for Wrangler jeans and, unfortunately, some off-field controversies. This move proved to be a turning point in Sterling's career, propelling him towards greatness. With Brett Favre as his quarterback, Sterling Sharpe had a remarkable 1992 season. He set a record with 108 receptions, a feat that showcased his exceptional skills. Additionally, he earned the Triple Crown, a prestigious achievement for a receiver leading the league in receptions, reception yards, and touchdowns. This accomplishment had only been achieved 4 times since the merger. Sterling Sharpe had a great start in his football career. In his first playoff game after doing well in the regular season, he had an outstanding performance. He caught 5 passes, gained 101 yards, and scored 3 touchdowns. But sadly, his success was short-lived. In 1994, he suffered a severe neck injury that forced him to retire immediately. What made it even more painful was that just 2 years later, the Packers won the Super Bowl with a new wide receiver, Reggie White, even though they had the same coach and quarterback. That was really tough. At least we got to see Sterling Sharpe at his best before his career ended. Some players weren't as fortunate. Take Billy Sims, for example. He was the first overall pick in the 1980 NFL Draft, chosen by the Detroit Lions. Despite the Lions having a better season than usual in 1980, Sims faced challenges. He led the team to a 9-7 record, their best in 10 years. Billy Sims had a good start to his career, achieving multiple 1,000-yard seasons and earning 3 Pro Bowl selections in his first 4 years. The Lions were doing well too. However, Sims's intense playing style, marked by passionate running, eventually led to his downfall. Unlike the other number 20 who did a lot of fancy moves and often did things differently from typical running backs, Billy just ran straight through opponents, using his strength to his advantage. Sometimes, he even kicked opponents while using another as a launch pad. It was pretty wild. However, Billy seemed to know that his aggressive style might not last, so he had a $225 million insurance policy in case he got a career-ending injury. Now, injuries for running backs are more likely than for other positions, but Billy's situation is more complicated than it seems. On October 21, 1984, Billy Sims led the Lions against the Minnesota Vikings. The Vikings' field was covered in hard AstroTurf, which the players didn't like. During one run, Billy claims his leg got stuck in the turf. He was lightly tackled by a linebacker, and to top it off, after fumbling the ball, he got steamrolled by a bunch of Vikings. His body just lay there in pain. So, after a knee injury, Billy Sims didn't pass the physical before next year's training camp, and that marked the end of his time as the greatest Lions running back. If you found this video interesting, make sure to subscribe to the channel.